It started with a call that didn't ask anything at all, just assumed I would still be where I always was, still waiting, still available, still small enough to command, and when I saw my son's name light up my phone that evening, I already knew how the sentence would sound before he even said it, that calm voice of his that never raised itself because it never had to, the kind of voice that believes obedience is natural, automatic, deserved. And sure enough, he said it exactly the way I expected. "I'm coming tonight, don't go anywhere," like he was reminding me of an appointment I'd forgotten, not announcing a demand, not crossing a line. Just stating what he believed was already decided, and I remember letting out a slow sigh through my nose, the kind you don't even realize you're holding in until it escapes, because that sentence carried years inside it. Years of small agreements that stopped being agreements somewhere along the way, years of me nodding on the phone, murmuring "it's fine" or "we'll manage" or "just this once, ha ha ha." I almost laughed out loud at how familiar it all felt. The timing especially, always the same week, always after the deposit cleared, always right when the balance looked fuller than usual, like clockwork, like ritual, like something practiced and perfected, and this time was no different. My pension had come in that morning. I'd circled the amount in red ink in my little notebook the way I always did, not because I planned anything special, but because it helped me feel organized. Helped me feel like I still had a grip on something, even if it was just numbers on a page, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had already gone lukewarm, staring at the steam curl up and disappear. When the call came through and as he spoke I stared at the checkbook lying open beside me, the pen still uncapped, the red circle too bright on the page, and something in me shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet click. Like a lock turning, because for the first time I didn't answer him right away, I didn't say okay, I didn't ask how much, I didn't even say hello back, I just listened to the sound of his certainty filling the space. And then I did something so small it almost felt wrong. I let the phone ring out, I turned it face down on the table and watched the screen fade to black, and my heart started thudding faster than I expected. Not from fear exactly, more from the unfamiliar feeling of not complying, of breaking a pattern that had been running on its own for so long I'd forgotten I could interrupt it. And as the silence settled in, thick and heavy, I realized how often that house had been filled with other people's voices and expectations, and how rarely it had been quiet on my own terms, and I sat there listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock on the wall, the distant sound of a car passing outside, and I thought about all the times I'd convinced myself this was normal, that family helps family, that this is what mothers do, that this is just how things change as you get older, you give, you shrink. You adjust, and I felt that familiar wave of doubt creep in, that little voice that whispers maybe you're overreacting, maybe you misunderstood, maybe he needs it more than you do, sigh. That voice had been so loud for so long it felt like my own, but tonight it sounded weaker somehow, like it was repeating a script that no longer fit the moment, and I closed the checkbook slowly, deliberately, feeling the weight of it in my hands, and slid it into the drawer I'd started locking again a few weeks earlier without really knowing why. Just a habit I'd picked up after noticing how often things went missing and then reappeared with explanations attached. And as I turned the key, I noticed my hands weren't shaking, which surprised me, because I'd expected this to feel bigger. Scarier, but instead it felt steady, like standing still while something rushed past you, and I looked around the kitchen and suddenly noticed details I'd stopped seeing, the scuff mark near the back door where someone always kicked their shoes off, the extra set of keys sitting in the bowl by the entryway, the chair that was always pulled out slightly, never pushed back in, like someone had just stepped away and expected to return. The realization made my chest tighten. Because it hit me then that this house had been treated like a waiting room for years, a place people passed through to collect what they needed, never quite mine, never fully respected. And outside I could hear a car pull into a driveway somewhere down the street, and my stomach clenched on instinct, my body already rehearsing the familiar rhythm of his arrival, the way tires crunch on gravel, the way a door slams a little harder than necessary, the way footsteps move through the hallway like they belong there, and I caught myself standing up, smoothing my sweater, straightening the table as if preparing for inspection. And I stopped mid-motion, my hand hovering over the back of the chair, and whispered out loud, "No," not angrily, not even confidently, just firmly enough to hear it myself, and I sat back down, the chair scraping softly against the floor, and let out a breath I'd been holding without realizing it, because something about tonight felt different, heavier, more charged, like a storm gathering quietly instead of crashing in all at once. And I wondered when exactly he'd started believing my pension was his, not help, not support, but ownership, when that shift happened without me noticing, when the language changed from asking to informing, from gratitude to expectation, and I stared at the phone lying face down on the table, knowing it would light up again any second, knowing there would be messages, maybe irritation first, then confusion, then anger. And I felt a strange mix of dread and resolve settle in my chest, because for the first time the fear wasn't about what he might do or say when he arrived, it was about what I might finally say back. And as the house grew quieter and the light outside dimmed, I realized that whatever happened tonight, whatever words were spoken or silences stretched thin, this was the moment something began to change. And if you've ever had someone speak to you like your answer didn't matter, like your presence was guaranteed and your compliance assumed, you know that moment too. The one where you realize the real story doesn't start when they show up at the door, it starts when you decide not to open it the same way anymore. And as my phone buzzed again, lighting up the table with his name, I didn't reach for it because I knew that by the time he arrived, things would already be very different, and he just didn't know it yet. What surprised me afterward wasn't the anger or the fear, it was how quickly my mind tried to bargain with itself, like it always did, whispering reasons and excuses before I could even name what I was feeling. Because once you stop answering right away, once you break that invisible rule, all the little details you've trained yourself not to notice suddenly line up in front of you. And that night, as I sat there with my untouched tea cooling beside me, I started thinking about how the money never disappeared all at once, not in a dramatic sweep, not in a way that felt obvious enough to protest. It went in pieces. Soft pieces, reasonable pieces, the kind you convince yourself don't count, a few hundred here, a transfer there, always with an explanation already prepared, just until the bonus comes in, just to cover the insurance. Just for a week, ha. I almost smiled bitterly thinking about how often the word just had been used, as if shrinking the language made the taking smaller, and I remembered how it started. How I still cooked the same meals at first, still bought the same groceries, still filled my cart without checking every price, but slowly, without noticing the exact moment, I'd begun pausing in the aisles. Comparing labels longer than necessary, putting meat back and choosing canned soup instead, telling myself it was healthier anyway. Oh, what a lie that was, and I thought about the pills lined up in the bathroom cabinet. How I'd started counting them before refills, spacing them out carefully, skipping one here and there, not because I couldn't afford them outright, but because I didn't want to ask, didn't want to explain, didn't want to hear that tone again. The one that sounds helpful but feels heavy, and I felt that familiar pinch of shame tighten in my chest, because somehow the taking had made me feel like the one doing something wrong, like I was mismanaging. Like I needed to justify my own needs, and as I replayed these moments, they stacked on top of each other until they felt undeniable, not just financial adjustments but quiet erasures. The way my favorite brand of tea disappeared and I told myself the cheaper one tasted fine, the way I stopped replacing worn slippers and wore them thin instead, the way I'd started keeping the lights off longer in the evenings, sitting in the dim glow of a lamp so the electric bill wouldn't become another topic of discussion. And it hit me then, not all at once but steadily, that this wasn't sacrifice for family, this was adaptation to pressure. And the difference mattered more than I'd ever allowed myself to admit because sacrifice is chosen, but this had been assumed, and I let out a slow breath, feeling my throat tighten as I remembered how often I'd smiled through it all. How often I'd said it's fine out loud while something inside me whispered that it wasn't, and that whisper had been easy to ignore when it came alone. But now it was louder, joined by the sound of my son's voice from earlier. That certainty wrapped in calm authority, and suddenly the kitchen felt smaller, like the walls were leaning in to listen, and I stood up and walked through the house, not in a rush, just slowly, deliberately. Noticing how much of my space had been rearranged over time without my permission, the stack of mail moved off the table, the extra chair pulled out and left that way, the bowl of keys by the door holding more than just mine. And each step felt like uncovering evidence I'd helped hide, and I laughed softly to myself, ha, because it was absurd in a painful way, how good I'd become at minimizing my own discomfort. How often I'd chosen peace over honesty, even when that peace cost me pieces of myself, and I stopped in the hallway and leaned against the wall, closing my eyes for a moment, feeling the ache in my knees, the quiet hum of the house, and wondering when exactly I'd started living like a guest in my own life, always careful, always accommodating, always ready to move aside, and the thought made my eyes sting, not with tears yet, but with that pressure right before them. The kind you swallow down because crying feels indulgent, unnecessary, dramatic, and I opened my eyes again and went back to the kitchen, where the drawer with the locked checkbook sat quietly. And I realized that tonight wasn't really about the call or the money or even his arrival, it was about the accumulation of all these small adjustments, all these tiny retreats that had added up to something heavy and unspoken. And for the first time, instead of asking myself how to smooth things over, I asked a different question, one that startled me with its simplicity. When did I agree to live like this? And there was no clear answer. No single moment I could point to, just a series of choices made out of love, fear, habit, and exhaustion, layered so neatly that they looked like obligation instead of loss. and as I sat back down at the table, my phone buzzed again. Another missed call, then another, and I didn't flip it over. I didn't check the screen because I already knew the tone would be changing now, from assumption to irritation, and I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not confidence exactly, but clarity, the kind that comes when you finally name something for what it is, and I thought, if this is what silence gives me, this space to see clearly, then maybe silence isn't weakness at all. Maybe it's the first step back to myself, and as the night deepened and the house stayed still, I knew that by the time he walked through that door, I wouldn't be the same person who'd nodded and adjusted and swallowed every time before. Because once you notice the cost of staying quiet, it's impossible to unsee it, and the question hanging in the air wasn't whether he would be angry when he arrived, but whether I was finally ready to stop shrinking to make that anger easier to bear. The truth I hadn't wanted to touch yet kept circling back to one quiet moment years ago, the kind you barely remember until it starts explaining everything, and that night, with my phone still buzzing face down on the table. My thoughts drifted there whether I invited them or not, back to the hospital room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and warm blankets, back to the way the ceiling tiles all look the same when you stare at them long enough, back to the way fear makes you agreeable in ways you don't recognize until much later, because that was when the paper appeared, not during an argument, not during a crisis like this, but during recovery. When my body was weak and my mind was foggy and everyone spoke softly to me like I was already halfway gone, and I remember my son sitting by the bed, his voice gentle, reassuring, telling me not to worry about a thing. Telling me he and his wife would handle the details, while I healed hahaha. I even remember smiling at how grown-up he sounded, how capable, how comforting it felt to let someone else decide for a while. And when the document was placed in front of me, clipped neatly to a folder, it didn't look dangerous at all. It looked official, helpful, temporary, and the words power of attorney didn't scare me then because they were wrapped in kindness. Wrapped in concern, wrapped in promises that this was just in case, just until I was back on my feet, just to make things easier, that word again, just, and I signed where they told me to sign, not because I didn't care, but because I trusted, because I believed love meant protection, and protection meant handing things over when you were told it was safer that way. And for a long time after, nothing seemed wrong, bills were paid, appointments were kept. And whenever I asked about something, I was told it was handled, already done, no need to worry, and I let myself believe that meant everything was fine, because questioning it felt ungrateful, felt rude. Felt like doubting people who said they were helping me, and as the months turned into years, the paper faded into the background of my life, tucked away in a drawer I didn't open often. Something I assumed still belonged to me in spirit if not in ink, until one day, quietly, without warning, I realized decisions were being made without me. Money was being moved without my knowledge, and when I asked questions, the answers came slower, heavier, tinged with irritation, like I was interrupting something, and that was when the discomfort began, small at first, easy to dismiss. Maybe they're just busy, maybe I'm forgetting things. Maybe this is what aging feels like, and I hated that thought more than anything, the idea that my own mind couldn't be trusted, that maybe the confusion was mine, not the situation's. And that doubt kept me quiet longer than anything else could have, because once you start questioning yourself, you hand over more than money, you hand over authority, and sitting there now, years later. The weight of that realization pressed into my chest because I could see it clearly at last. That signature hadn't stolen anything on its own, it had simply opened a door, and over time, that door had been pushed wider and wider until someone else felt comfortable walking through it without knocking, and I found myself standing up again, drawn to the back room where I kept old files and folders. The place I avoided because it felt like admitting I needed proof to trust my own memory, and my hands hovered over the drawer for a moment before I opened it, feeling my heart thump a little harder, not from fear of what I'd find, but from the fear of confirming what I already knew, and there it was, the document, neatly filed, my name printed clearly at the top, my signature just as clear at the bottom, strong even, not shaky at all, ha. That made me laugh under my breath because it reminded me how capable I'd been even then, how much I'd underestimated myself since, and I sat down at the desk with the paper spread out in front of me, reading it slowly. Line by line, this time not through the lens of trust but through the lens of reality, and each sentence landed heavier than the last, not because it was cruel or malicious, but because it was thorough, comprehensive, designed to transfer control completely and cleanly, and I felt a sharp sting behind my eyes as I realized how carefully my authority had been wrapped and handed over without a clear path back. And the anger that rose then surprised me with its quietness. It wasn't explosive, it didn't make me clench my fists or pace the room, it settled into me like a cold understanding, the kind that doesn't shout but doesn't leave either. And I whispered it was supposed to be temporary, to the empty room, and the room, of course, didn't argue because the paper didn't say that. The paper didn't promise to give anything back unless someone decided to. And that was the moment something hardened inside me, not into bitterness but into resolve, because I understood finally that waiting for someone else to return what they had grown used to holding was pointless. And the phone buzzed again behind me, another call, another attempt to pull me back into the old rhythm, and I didn't turn around. I didn't answer because my focus was on that document, on the power it represented and the power I had assumed I'd lost, and I thought, maybe the mistake wasn't trusting them back then, maybe the mistake was believing trust couldn't be corrected. And as I folded the paper carefully and placed it back in the folder, my hands steady, my breath even, I knew that whatever happened when he showed up later, whatever words were thrown at me, this was the true beginning. Because once you understand exactly how something was taken, you can finally figure out how to take it back. And the question that echoed through my mind as I locked the drawer wasn't whether I had the right to change things now, but how long it would take for them to realize that I already had. I didn't make the call right away, and that surprised me too, because for years I'd trained myself to hesitate before reaching out for anything that might stir trouble, but that night hesitation felt different. Less like fear and more like careful breathing, like I was steadying myself before stepping onto unfamiliar ground. And when I finally picked up the phone, my fingers paused over the screen longer than usual, my heart giving a slow, heavy thud as if it already knew this was a line that couldn't be uncrossed once drawn, and the woman who answered didn't sound rushed or sharp or suspicious the way I'd imagined. She sounded calm, almost gentle, like someone who had heard many versions of this story and didn't need mine to be dramatic to take it seriously, and that alone made my throat tighten, because being believed without having to convince anyone felt unfamiliar. And I found myself explaining things in fragments at first, half sentences, careful words, like I was testing whether it was safe to say them out loud, and she listened without interrupting, without filling the silence, without telling me what I should have done differently. And when I finally stopped talking, when my voice trailed off into that quiet space, she didn't rush to respond. She simply said, "You're not imagining this," and something inside me loosened. Something I hadn't realized was clenched so tightly, because those 4 words landed harder than any advice could have, and I felt my eyes sting, not with sadness exactly, but with relief, sigh deep and unexpected. And she explained her role slowly, clearly, told me there were options, told me I didn't have to decide anything tonight, told me help didn't have to arrive with flashing lights or raised voices, that sometimes it arrived quietly. Just to listen, just to witness, just to make sure I wasn't standing alone anymore. And I remember laughing softly, ha ha ha, a strange sound even to my own ears, because part of me had expected judgment, interrogation, questions about why I'd waited so long, but none of that came, only reassurance that waiting doesn't erase your right to act. And when she asked if someone could come by, just to sit, just to observe, just to be present, my first instinct was to say no, to protect the peace I'd been conditioned to protect at all costs. But then I thought about the paper in the drawer, the locked checkbook, the calls lighting up my phone. And I heard myself say yes before doubt could catch up, and after I hung up, the house felt different, not louder, not brighter, just steadier, like it had shifted on its foundation slightly, and I noticed how my shoulders dropped an inch, how my breathing slowed, how the tight knot under my ribs eased, and I moved around the kitchen again, wiping down the counter that was already clean, straightening the placemats that didn't need it, just giving my hands something to do while my mind adjusted to the idea that tonight wouldn't follow the usual script. And when the knock came, it was softer than I expected, not demanding, not impatient, just 3 quiet taps. And I opened the door to a woman who looked exactly like someone meant to blend into the background, neutral clothes, calm eyes, no sharp edges, and she introduced herself simply, stepping inside without ceremony, without that subtle sense of invasion I'd grown used to, and we sat at the table together, 2 mugs between us, steam rising, and she asked practical questions in a tone that didn't feel invasive, questions about patterns, about frequency, about how things made me feel, and each answer felt easier than the last, like opening a window 1 inch at a time. And when she asked if anyone else was expected that evening, my stomach tightened again. Because suddenly the abstract became real, the call, the threat wrapped in certainty, the arrival I'd been bracing for, and I nodded, telling her he said he was coming, that he expected me to be here, and she didn't flinch, didn't warn, didn't advise me to leave, she simply acknowledged it calmly, like it was a fact, not a crisis, and that steadiness grounded me more than anything else could have, because for once I wasn't the one carrying the weight of anticipation alone. And as we sat there waiting, the phone buzzed again on the table, lighting up the room with his name, and I felt that old reflex twitch in my hand, the urge to answer, to smooth things over before they escalated, and I caught myself, drew my hand back and let the silence sit, and the woman across from me noticed, not judging, just observing, and gave a small nod, like she understood exactly how hard that moment was. And I realized then that this wasn't about confrontation anymore, It was about presence, about having someone there who could see the dynamic clearly, who wouldn't be swayed by history or guilt or obligation. And the clock on the wall ticked louder as the minutes passed, each one stretching slightly, and with every tick I felt something settle deeper inside me, a quiet certainty that whatever happened next, whatever words were spoken when the door finally opened, I wouldn't be standing there alone or doubting my own reality. And as headlights swept briefly across the front window, my chest tightened again, not with panic but with focus. Because this was the moment everything I'd been avoiding was about to surface, and I took a slow breath, steadying myself, knowing that the calm voice I'd invited into my home had already changed the balance in ways he wouldn't understand until it was far too late. He arrived the way he always did, with confidence that filled the space before he even crossed the threshold, and I could feel it through the walls, through the floor, through the familiar rhythm of his steps on the porch. Each one sounding like punctuation, like the end of a sentence I'd been writing for years, and for a split second my body reacted on instinct, shoulders tightening, breath catching, that old reflex to prepare, to brace, to make room sigh. But then I looked across the table and saw her sitting there calmly, hands folded around her mug, posture relaxed, eyes steady, and something inside me stayed still instead of shrinking, and that difference mattered more than I can explain. Because when the door opened and he stepped inside without knocking, coat still buttoned, phone already in his hand like he might need it as proof or leverage, his eyes went straight to me first, just as they always had. Scanning for my reaction, my readiness, my usual compliance, and I didn't give it to him. I didn't stand, I didn't apologize, I didn't even speak. I just stayed where I was, and he faltered, not enough for him to notice consciously, but enough for me to see it, that tiny hitch in his movement when his gaze shifted past me and landed on the woman at the table. And he froze, actually froze, not dramatically, not with wide eyes or raised voices. Just a stiffening like his mind had hit an unexpected wall, and the room went very quiet, the kind of quiet that hums, and he looked from her to me and back again, trying to place her. Trying to decide whether she was a threat or an inconvenience or something he could talk his way around, and I could almost hear the calculations clicking behind his eyes, and he cleared his throat, forcing a smile that didn't quite land. "Who's this?" he asked, as if the question itself might reassert his control, and before I could answer, before I even thought about it, the woman spoke, calmly, evenly, not introducing herself with importance or authority. Just stating her presence, and that was when the shift became undeniable, because he wasn't the only one speaking anymore, he wasn't the only one witnessing the dynamic, and I watched his confidence drain by degrees. Replaced with irritation first, then uncertainty, and he tried to recover, turning back to me, lowering his voice slightly like he was doing me a favor, like this was still between us. "We need to talk," he said, emphasis heavy on need. And I almost laughed, because the irony of that word in that moment felt sharp, and I nodded slowly, deliberately, and said, "We are," and the woman beside me didn't move, didn't interrupt, didn't take over, she just stayed there. Present, and that presence did more than any argument ever could have, because suddenly he couldn't frame this as a misunderstanding or a family matter to be smoothed over. It was being witnessed, and I saw the frustration creep into his face. The impatience, the way his jaw tightened, and he tried again, this time with a hint of authority, reminding me of bills, of responsibilities, of how things had always been handled, and each word felt like an echo from another life. One I'd already stepped out of, and I listened, really listened, without interrupting, without defending myself, and when he finished, when he finally ran out of momentum, I let the silence stretch just a little longer than comfortable. Long enough for him to feel it, and then I spoke, quietly, not rehearsed, not emotional, just honest. And I told him I hadn't agreed to this arrangement the way he thought I had, that things had shifted without my consent. That the money wasn't his to assume, and as I spoke I felt that familiar flutter of fear rise, the worry that my voice would shake or my words would crumble under his gaze, but they didn't, they held. Because this time they weren't landing in empty space, they were being heard by someone else too, and he laughed then, a short, disbelieving sound like I'd just told a joke that didn't quite make sense, and he looked at the woman again. Eyes narrowing, trying to gauge her role, and I could see the question forming, the unspoken challenge, and she met his look evenly, not rising to it, not backing down, just acknowledging it. And that was when I realized how much of his power had always come from privacy, from the assumption that whatever happened between us would stay between us, unexamined, unquestioned, and I felt a strange surge of clarity, not triumph. Not revenge, just recognition, and somewhere in the middle of all that, as the tension settled into something thick and electric, I want to pause here for just a moment, because if any part of this feels familiar, if you've ever had someone speak to you like your answer was already decided, like your space and your time and your resources were theirs by default, you're not alone, and these stories don't get told enough, so if you want to hear more of them, more moments where quiet strength changes the outcome, take a second to subscribe. It helps these stories reach the people who need them most, and when the moment passed and the air shifted again, he straightened. Irritation giving way to something colder, something more cautious, and he said, "This doesn't have to get ugly." And I almost smiled, because I'd heard that line before too, always right before someone realized they were losing ground. And I replied evenly, "It already did, just not the way you think." And he looked at me then, really looked at me, like he was seeing a version of me he hadn't prepared for. And I knew in that instant that whatever he'd come here expecting, it wasn't this, it wasn't resistance wrapped in calm, it wasn't a table he no longer controlled. And as the seconds ticked by and the room held its breath, I felt something settle deep in my chest, a certainty that this night, this moment of frozen confidence and quiet witnessing, was only the beginning of a shift he wouldn't fully understand until much later. Because when someone walks in assuming ownership and walks out realizing they have none, the real reckoning doesn't happen at the door, it happens afterward, and that was still coming. What followed wasn't shouting or accusations the way I'd once imagined it might be. It was something quieter and far more unsettling. A slow realization spreading across his face as he understood that the ground beneath him wasn't solid anymore, and I watched that understanding take shape while he stood there, hands loose at his sides, eyes darting briefly around the kitchen like he might find the old version of me hiding somewhere, ready to step in and smooth things over, ha, but that version never appeared, and the silence stretched in a way that felt intentional now. Not awkward, not apologetic, just firm, and he cleared his throat again, adjusting his stance as if posture alone could bring the balance back in his favor, and he tried a different tone, softer this time, almost reasonable, reminding me of how much he had helped, how much stress there had been lately, how complicated things were for him and his wife, and I listened without interrupting, nodding once or twice, not in agreement. But to show I was hearing him, and that alone seemed to confuse him because I wasn't reacting the way he expected. I wasn't defending or justifying or backing down, I was simply present, and when he finished, when the words finally ran out and hung there waiting for their usual effect, I took a slow breath and spoke again, telling him calmly that helping doesn't mean deciding for someone, that support doesn't give ownership, that caring doesn't cancel consent, and each sentence landed with more weight than I'd expected, not because they were sharp, but because they were steady, and he frowned slightly, like he was trying to poke holes in what I was saying and finding none. And for a moment I almost felt sorry for him, because it's disorienting to realize the rules you've been playing by no longer apply. But that sympathy didn't last long, because the next thing he did was sigh heavily and shake his head, muttering something about how difficult I was being, and that old spark of anger flared briefly in my chest. The familiar sting of being framed as the problem for finally speaking up, and I noticed how quickly he tried to reclaim the narrative, suggesting that maybe I was confused, maybe I didn't fully understand the paperwork I'd signed. Maybe someone had put ideas in my head, and I felt my jaw tighten just a fraction, because there it was, the same quiet dismissal I'd lived under for years, the implication that my clarity must have come from somewhere else, not from me. And before I could respond, the woman at the table shifted slightly, not stepping in, not speaking for me, just repositioning herself, and that small movement broke his rhythm. Reminded him again that this conversation was no longer private, no longer insulated from accountability, and I spoke then, a little more firmly than before. Telling him I understood exactly what I'd signed and exactly what I was doing now, telling him that this wasn't confusion, it was correction, and the words seemed to hang in the air between us, heavy and undeniable, and he laughed again. But this time it sounded forced, brittle, like glass tapped too hard, and he said something about how I was blowing things out of proportion, how families don't bring outsiders into their business, and I felt a strange calm wash over me. Because that sentence revealed more than he realized. It showed how much he relied on isolation to maintain control, how uncomfortable he was with light shining into spaces he preferred kept dim. And I told him quietly that the only reason this felt extreme was because it was no longer hidden, and that's when his irritation sharpened into something colder, something edged with threat, not overt, not loud but present, and he said, "You're making this harder than it needs to be," and I almost smiled, ha, because that phrase had been used on me so many times before, always when someone wanted me to stop resisting and start accommodating again. And I replied evenly, "It doesn't get easier by pretending it's not happening." And he looked at me then with a mixture of disbelief and calculation, like he was reassessing a strategy mid-game, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The clock ticking loudly on the wall, the refrigerator humming softly, the house bearing witness, and in that stillness I realized something important, something that shifted my own understanding of power. It wasn't that he'd lost it all at once. It was that it had slipped away gradually, the moment I stopped reacting the way he expected, the moment I stopped explaining myself, the moment I allowed silence and witnesses to do their work, and I felt a quiet sense of grounding. Like my feet were finally planted on something solid, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was lower, more cautious, asking what exactly I wanted, and I didn't answer right away because that question deserved honesty. Not a rushed response, and as I considered it, I realized how simple the answer actually was. I wanted control back over my own life, my own decisions, my own money, my own space. Nothing extravagant, nothing punitive, just mine. And when I said it out loud, plainly, without embellishment, it felt almost anticlimactic because the truth often does, and he stared at me for a long moment, absorbing it, and I could see the frustration flicker again. Followed by resignation, and he stepped back slightly, not physically retreating, but mentally recalibrating, and that was when I knew the table truly wasn't his anymore, not the literal one we were sitting at, and not the figurative one he'd assumed control of for so long. And as he turned toward the door, shoulders stiff, face set in a way that suggested unfinished business, I felt a mix of relief and anticipation settle in my chest. Because this conversation wasn't the end, it was a threshold, and while he might walk out believing he'd simply been delayed or inconvenienced, I knew something deeper had shifted, something irreversible. And as the door closed behind him and the house fell quiet again, I sat there for a moment longer, letting the silence wrap around me, not as punishment but as confirmation, knowing that the real consequences of this night hadn't even begun to unfold yet. The morning after felt strangely ordinary, which was the most surprising part of all because I'd expected to wake up with my chest tight, my head full of second-guessing, my mind replaying every word from the night before. But instead I opened my eyes and felt clear, not peaceful exactly, but settled, like something heavy had finally been set down, and as I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the house, I realized how rare that feeling had become, how long it had been since my first thought of the day wasn't about what someone else needed from me, and I let out a long sigh, the kind that empties you out a little. Before pushing myself out of bed and moving through my morning slowly, deliberately, making coffee the way I like it, strong and unhurried, standing by the window while it brewed instead of rushing back to the table to check my phone. Because for once I wasn't waiting for anything, and when I finally did glance at the screen, there it was, exactly as expected, missed calls stacked one after another, a few messages layered in between, irritation creeping into the words. Then accusation, then a sudden switch to concern that felt thin and rehearsed, ha. I shook my head softly at how predictable the pattern was once you stepped outside it, and without opening a single message, I set the phone down again. Because today wasn't about responding, it was about moving, and that thought steadied me as I got dressed, choosing a simple sweater, the one that made me feel grounded instead of invisible, and gathered the folder from the drawer. The one I hadn't opened in years, the one I'd avoided like it might bite me, and as I slid into the car and pulled out of the driveway, my hands rested easily on the steering wheel, no shaking, no hesitation. Just a quiet sense of purpose, and I remember noticing how bright the morning looked, how the sun caught on the edges of things I'd stopped seeing, the tops of trees, the shine on parked cars. The way the world kept going whether or not I made myself smaller inside it, and when I walked into the bank, the air cool and faintly scented with paper and cleaning solution, I felt a familiar flicker of nerves, awe. But it didn't slow me down, it just reminded me that this mattered, and I approached the desk, explained calmly why I was there, passed over the folder, and waited while the man behind the counter read through the documents carefully. Not rushing, not questioning my intent, and when he looked up and nodded, something inside me clicked into place, a confirmation I hadn't realized I needed, and as he explained the steps, the forms, the changes that would take effect immediately, I listened closely, asked questions without apologizing for them, and signed where needed with a steady hand, and when it was done. When the papers were stamped and filed and slid back across the desk, I felt an unexpected wave of emotion rise up, not triumph, not anger, but relief so deep it almost brought tears to my eyes. Because for the first time in a long while, something important had been handled without negotiation, without guilt, without someone else speaking over me. And I stepped back out into the sunlight holding that folder like it contained more than paper, like it held proof that I hadn't imagined any of this, that I hadn't waited too long, that it wasn't too late, and as I sat back in the car, my phone buzzed again, this time with a message that read differently, less demanding, more cautious, asking if we could talk, and I let out a soft, humorless laugh, ha, because now that the ground had shifted, the tone was changing too. And I didn't respond then either, not because I was being cruel or dramatic, but because I was finally allowing myself time to breathe, time to exist without explaining. And when I drove home and pulled into my driveway, the house looked the same as it always had, but it felt different stepping inside, quieter in a good way, like it was waiting for me instead of bracing itself, and I placed the folder back in the drawer, locked it, and stood there for a moment with my hand resting on the wood, feeling the weight of what I'd just done settle into something solid and real. And as the day went on, as the calls slowed and the messages softened, I realized that the real shift wasn't just legal or financial. It was internal. It was the knowledge that I'd acted without asking permission, and that knowledge changed how I moved, how I stood, how I thought, and that night. As I sat at the table with another cup of tea, watching the light fade outside, I understood something that made my chest tighten all over again, not with fear this time, but with anticipation. Because taking back control is rarely the end of the story, it's the moment that forces everyone else to decide how they'll respond next, and I knew, deep down, that the response coming my way was going to test this new steadiness in ways I wasn't fully prepared for yet. The visit came sooner than I expected, which told me everything I needed to know about how uncomfortable the silence had made them, because when control slips, it's rarely the loss that scares people, it's the not knowing what comes next. And that afternoon, I noticed the car in the driveway before I even heard the knock, parked crooked, rushed, like whoever left it hadn't planned to stay long but needed to be seen. And I felt that familiar tightening in my chest for a split second, the old instinct to prepare myself for disappointment, for guilt, for being told I was wrong in a calm voice that pretended to care, sigh. But the feeling passed quicker than it ever had before, replaced by something steadier, and when I opened the door, there he was, standing just a little too close. Eyes scanning my face like he was trying to locate the version of me he expected to deal with, and he didn't waste time. He rarely did when he was uncomfortable. He stepped inside without waiting to be invited and started talking before the door was even fully closed, telling me they were worried, telling me this had gone too far, telling me people were confused. And the word people hung there in the air like a shield, vague and convenient, and I listened, leaning lightly against the counter, arms relaxed at my sides, not defensive, not welcoming either, just present, and as he spoke, I noticed the subtle shift in his tone, the way concern slowly gave way to frustration when it didn't land, the way his sentences grew sharper when I didn't interrupt or reassure him, and he started framing the situation differently. Less about help and more about consequences, about how things didn't have to be this way, about how I was making it harder than it needed to be, ha, that phrase again. Like it had been printed on a card somewhere and passed down through generations, and I felt a flicker of sadness then, not for myself, but for how familiar the tactic was, because when guilt doesn't work, pressure usually follows. And I waited until he finished, until the room fell quiet except for the ticking clock on the wall, and then I spoke, not raising my voice, not explaining myself in circles, just stating calmly that I wasn't confused. I wasn't being influenced, and I wasn't undoing anything out of spite, and the look on his face when I said that told me how much he'd been counting on one of those being true. Because his jaw tightened and he exhaled sharply through his nose, and he said something about family loyalty, about how this didn't look good, about how outsiders didn't need to be involved. And that's when I felt the last of that old hesitation dissolve, because I understood then that what he was really upset about wasn't the money or the paperwork, it was the loss of privacy around his authority. The fact that someone else now knew what had been happening behind closed doors, and I told him quietly that secrecy isn't the same as loyalty, and the room seemed to go still around us like even the walls were listening. And he stared at me for a moment, trying to decide if this was still a phase, something that would pass if he pushed the right button, and when he realized it wasn't, his voice dropped, not loud, not angry, but edged with something colder, asking me what I thought would happen next, and I didn't answer right away because that question carried a lot of weight. It assumed fear, it assumed uncertainty, it assumed I was bracing for fallout. And when I finally met his eyes and said I wasn't worried about what came next anymore, his expression shifted in a way I hadn't seen before, a mix of disbelief and something like respect he didn't want to acknowledge. And he took a step back, not fully retreating but reassessing, and in that moment I understood how deeply he'd relied on my predictability, how my calm compliance had been the foundation of his confidence, and now that it was gone, he didn't quite know where to stand, and he left not with a slam or a final word but with a stiff nod and a warning wrapped in concern, telling me to think carefully about what I was doing, and as the door closed behind him, I stood there in the quiet, letting the echo of his words settle and then fade, because for the first time they didn't sink in, they didn't burrow under my skin or keep me awake at night, they just passed through. And as I turned back toward the kitchen and poured myself another cup of tea, my hands steady, my breath even, I realized that the hardest part wasn't standing up to him, it was accepting that he might never understand why I had to. And that acceptance felt like another kind of freedom, one that made room for what came next, because now that the story had been challenged, the future was no longer something I needed permission to shape. The quiet that followed felt different from the silences I'd known before, not heavy or punishing, but open, like a pause that actually belonged to me. And in that space I began thinking less about what I was stepping away from and more about what I was stepping toward, which surprised me, because for so long my energy had been spent reacting, adjusting, surviving. And now there was room to consider something else entirely, and I realized that fixing the past wasn't going to be my project anymore, not rewriting old conversations in my head, not waiting for apologies that might never come. Not hoping for sudden understanding from people who benefited from not having it, sigh, that thought alone lifted something off my chest, and I found myself looking around the house differently. Not scanning for what might be questioned or criticized, but noticing what still felt like mine, the worn arm of the couch where I always sat, the window that caught the afternoon light just right. The small shelf of books no one ever touched because they weren't important enough, ha, and I sat there for a long while, just noticing, letting myself feel the weight of choice settle in. Because choosing the future over the past meant accepting that some doors wouldn't reopen, that some relationships would remain strained or distant, and that was a loss I couldn't ignore or dress up as strength. It hurt in a quiet way. The kind that doesn't demand tears but lingers behind your eyes, and I let myself feel it without rushing to resolve it, because pretending it didn't matter had cost me enough already, and later that afternoon I took out another folder. One I hadn't touched since my husband passed, filled with documents that felt too final to revisit, and as I spread them out on the table, I felt a tremor of hesitation run through me, not fear, but the gravity of what comes next when you stop postponing important decisions, and I read slowly, carefully, not skimming, not avoiding the hard parts, and with each page I felt something align inside me. A sense that this wasn't about punishment or reward, it was about protection, about making sure the life I'd built and the little I still had would be used the way I intended. Not absorbed quietly by those who assumed it would eventually be theirs, and I made notes in the margins, questions for later, names spelled carefully, details considered with a kind of tenderness I hadn't allowed myself in years. And when I reached the end of the stack, I sat back and closed my eyes for a moment, breathing through the mix of emotions swirling in my chest, sadness, resolve, relief, and something like peace. And I thought about how often I'd been told not to think too far ahead, not to complicate things, not to stir anything up, and I smiled softly, because there was nothing complicated about wanting clarity. Nothing dramatic about choosing intention over avoidance, and in the days that followed, I moved through my routines with a new awareness, not rushing, not hesitating either, just doing what needed to be done when it needed doing. Answering some calls, letting others go unanswered, speaking plainly when I spoke at all, and I noticed how my body responded to this shift, how my shoulders stayed lower, how my breath came easier, how the constant low-grade tension I'd lived with for so long began to loosen its grip, and one evening, as I sat by the window watching the sky darken, I felt a sudden wave of grief rise up, unexpected and sharp. Because choosing a future also meant grieving the version of family I'd hoped for but never quite had, and I let the tears come then, quietly, without shame, wiping them away and breathing through the ache, because grief doesn't mean regret. It just means something mattered, and when the wave passed, I felt steadier than before, grounded in the knowledge that honoring myself didn't erase love, it redefined it, and as I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I understood something that felt both comforting and daunting. This wasn't the end of conflict or complexity, it was the beginning of a different kind of responsibility. The responsibility of standing by my own decisions even when no one clapped or approved, and as I lay there in the dark, listening to the house settle around me, I knew there was one more step ahead. One final moment that would test whether this future I was choosing could hold its ground when the past tried to reach back in one last time. The test came quietly, the way most real tests do, not with raised voices or dramatic entrances, but with an ordinary morning that asked me who I was going to be now, and I woke before the sun that day. The house still wrapped in that soft, early hush that makes everything feel possible, and I lay there listening to the steady rhythm of my own breathing, noticing how calm it sounded, how unhurried, and I smiled faintly, because that alone felt like a victory I hadn't known how to measure before, and when I got up and set the table, I did it without checking my phone first, without bracing for interruption, without rehearsing responses in my head. Just plates, simple fruit, a pot of coffee filling the kitchen with warmth, and as the light crept in through the window, I realized how much I'd missed mornings like this, mornings that belonged to no one else's expectations. And halfway through pouring the coffee, the doorbell rang, not sharp or demanding, just one clear chime, and I paused, mug in hand, heart steady, not racing, not sinking, just aware, and through the front window I saw him standing there. Hands empty, shoulders slightly rounded, older somehow than he'd looked just days before, and for a moment I felt that familiar pull, the instinct to soften, to fix, to open the door and absorb whatever emotion he brought with him, sigh. But it passed, replaced by something quieter and firmer, and when I opened the door I didn't step back to let him in automatically. I stayed where I was, giving the space the respect it deserved, and he looked at me, really looked at me. as if seeing for the first time that the ground rules had changed, and he started to speak, stopping himself once, then trying again, his voice lower, less certain, and he said he just wanted to talk, just for a minute, and I nodded. Not inviting him inside, not closing the door either, just listening, and as he spoke, I heard the effort in his words, the careful choice of tone, the way he avoided commands and softened assumptions. And I understood then that this was the moment I'd been preparing for without realizing it, not the confrontation, not the paperwork, but this, the request without entitlement, the presence without certainty. And I felt a wave of compassion rise up, not the kind that erases boundaries, but the kind that acknowledges change without rushing to reward it, and when he finished, when the silence settled between us, I took a slow breath and told him calmly that I wasn't closing the door forever, but I wasn't reopening it the way it had been either, that things would be different now, slower, clearer, with room for respect and limits, and he nodded once. Like someone absorbing a language they were still learning, and he left without argument, without promises, without demands, just a quiet departure that felt honest in its own way. And as I closed the door and turned the lock, not out of fear but out of intention, I leaned my forehead briefly against the wood and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, ha, because for the first time I didn't feel drained by the interaction, I felt complete. And the rest of the day unfolded gently. I watered the plants, swept the porch, replaced the old welcome mat with one that said exactly what I meant, no surprises, no expectations, and later I sat by the window with my tea, watching the garden catch the late afternoon light, and I thought about how silence had once felt like something done to me, something imposed, something that swallowed my voice, and how now it felt like space, like choice, like rest. And I smiled at the thought because strength, I'd learned, doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it settles in quietly and stays, and that evening, as the house grew still again, I set the table early, just enough for myself. Not because I was lonely, but because I enjoyed the ritual, the care, the sense of home returning to its proper shape. And when I finally picked up my phone, not out of obligation but curiosity, I saw messages that no longer felt urgent, no longer held power over my mood, and I set it down again without answering, content in the knowledge that I could respond when and if I chose, and as night fell and the lights dimmed, I realized something that made my chest warm in a way I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't waiting anymore, not for permission, not for understanding, not for approval. I was living fully and deliberately. And if you've stayed with this story until now, if any part of it felt uncomfortably familiar or quietly hopeful, know this: reclaiming your life doesn't require shouting or revenge, it starts with one steady decision at a time. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories where quiet strength changes everything, you're always welcome to stay, because sometimes the most powerful ending isn't a dramatic one at all, it's simply the moment a house exhales, and the person inside it finally feels at home again.